As we get closer and closer to the November election, I've been talking about how much of Donald Trump's behavior over the next 3 months is going to be coming of a place of desperation, from a place of desperation, out of a sense of desperation. And David Shipler wrote a really interesting article yesterday in Washington Monthly called Beware of a Cornered Trump, which really builds on this idea that you and I have been talking about for a while, that if Donald Trump's polling continues to be bad, and remember, he's pretending like he doesn't believe the polling, but his actions speak otherwise, replacing his campaign manager, and all of the, restarting coronavirus briefings, all wearing a mask, all the things that he's doing. If his polling doesn't improve, it doesn't have to necessarily get worse, but just if it doesn't improve, we would expect, based on everything we know about Donald Trump, that he would go even more in the directions that we have seen him tend to, directions of corruption and depravity and authoritarian tendencies, which will likely become even more severe. And case in point, we're really already seeing that. Over the last couple of weeks, the deployment of camouflage troops with no badges to Portland, Oregon, where they are throwing people into unmarked vans and claiming that they're going to expand to more cities, even as soon as this week, and we'll see if that happens. We're seeing the authoritarianism and really the desperation and the disregard for human life manifest in the demand from Trump that schools just open in the fall. Health considerations be damned, just get open. We are seeing Donald Trump's desperation to prevent people from voting against him manifest in his unhinged opposition to vote by mail, which in practice this year just means expand absentee ballots through the process we already have to whoever wants it. Just virulent opposition to that on completely false and bogus grounds. And as David Shipler says in this article, which we're going to link to and I encourage you to read, and I like this term, Trump has no moral brakes. There's nothing there where morality would pump the brakes for him. David Shipler goes on to say his values are those of a mafia boss who rewards and punishes those who protect or oppose him, who protect for opposing him, punishes those who protect or oppose him. Now, to be thorough, David Shipler also mentions our fear could be wrong. Maybe Trump won't go completely off the rails. For example, maybe Trump won't send these armed paramilitaries that are now being floated in places like Portland. Maybe Trump won't send them to monitor polling places to intimidate voters in November. We're worried that he's going to do that, but maybe he won't do it. Maybe our fear is overblown, and we hope that it's overblown in the sense that Trump could be too incompetent or unable to think far enough ahead to actually do the horrible things that he would have no moral problem doing. If Trump stops short of what we fear he would do, it would be not because of a moral awakening, but because he forgets or is incompetent or is unable to get something done. But there is this constant feedback loop or vicious cycle. Trump's ignorance and delusions of grandeur and narcissism reinforce his most dangerous impulses, which, when he does and sees that he gets a reaction, reinforces his narcissism and delusions of grandeur and victimhood mentality that no one's been treated as poorly as him. You combine this with this silver spoon upbringing and what appears to be probably some personality disorders based on the mental health professionals we've spoken to. There is no check on Trump's behavior anywhere. And in fact, when we hear that Trump had an idea and didn't carry it out, it typically is because either A, he gets distracted by something else, or B, a group of people in his administration are able to talk him out of it or prevent him from doing it, and then he moves on to something else. It comes down to what can he get away with? What can the people around him stop him from doing? And it also shouldn't be ignored that the administration is in itself a threat by virtue of its mere existence. This is an administration that has been a threat to the economy. It's been a threat to international relations and our alliances with other countries. The administration, obviously, in what we're seeing with coronavirus, has been an existential threat to public health. There continues to be a shockingly large percentage of Americans, though, that still support the president and still support this administration, despite everything that's going on right now. And that is sort of part two of how a desperate Trump becomes a dangerous Trump. Some portion of Trump supporters, and I don't know what the number is, but I fear that it's a larger percentage than we want to admit. Some portion of Trump supporters are willing to do violence, like real world violence, if that's what Donald Trump suggests or implies or in any way signals may be appropriate. And so when Donald Trump said to Chris Wallace on Sunday, when asked, can you just say you'll accept the election results? Trump didn't do it. He said, I have to see the election results before I can tell you whether I would accept them. When you start to hear about the paramilitaries showing up in Portland, we have to remember that a portion of this man's followers are more than willing, some are eager to get out there and commit physical violence on the streets in the name of Donald Trump. Trump has shown us that if we try to predict how far he will go, we're always wrong. He's always willing to go further than whatever our predictions are at any point in time. And the more cornered he gets, and that's what I believe he increasingly is right now, the more outrageous and belligerent his behavior is going to get. I wonder what stories there are to be told, which maybe we will hear someday, about the things Trump almost did during this administration, and someone was just barely able to, but was able to stop him from doing it. You know, the stories about the things he did are bad enough. There must be just a treasure trove of nightmares about the things he almost did that someone stopped him from doing. And the next 3+ months, three months and a few weeks up until the election, are likely to be the most dangerous Trump because of the desperation and the feeling cornered. And the cognitive stuff is increasingly taking center stage. And I want to talk about that a little bit next. So the self-inflicted damage for Donald Trump continues to be done. The doctor who developed the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, that's the so-called test that Trump took and claims he aced. The doctor that created that test has come out and said, listen, this is supposed to be an easy test. It's really just meant to screen out relatively serious cognitive decline. And remember that this is now relevant again, because in Donald Trump's bizarre interview with Fox News host Chris Wallace over the weekend, Trump talked about how he aced the test. Joe Biden couldn't do well on the test, Trump said. Trump said the last 5 questions are really tough. And at one point, when Chris Wallace said they're not really tough, Trump accused Chris Wallace of being unable to answer some of the questions. It was completely outrageous as far as a thing to say. But more importantly, the real story here, as we're now hearing, as we hear from the doctor who developed the test, the story is that Trump found some of the questions difficult. That's really the red flag. Here's a reminder of what Donald Trump said before we get to what the doctor has now said.
People, who is more competent? Whose mind is sounder? Biden beats you in that.
Well, I tell you what, let's take a test. Let's take a test right now. Let's go down. Joe and I will take a test. Let him take the same test that I took.
Incidentally, I took the test, too, when I heard that you passed it.
Yeah, how did you do it?
Well, it's not the hardest test.
No, but
there's a picture, and it says, what's that? And it's an elephant.
No. You see, that's all misrepresentation.
Well, that's what it was on the web.
It's all misrepresentation. Because, yes, the first few questions are easy, but I'll bet you couldn't even answer the last 5 questions. I'll bet you couldn't. They get very hard, the last 5 questions.
Well, one of them was count back from 100 by 7.
And let me tell you,
93.
You couldn't answer.
All right, what's the question?
Many of the questions. I'd get you the test. I'd like to give it. But I guarantee you that Joe Biden could not answer those questions. Okay? And I answered all 35 questions correctly.
So Trump said the first few questions are easy, but I bet you couldn't even answer the last 5 questions. They get very hard. Now, it is strange. This is a test, again, meant to screen out relatively serious cognitive decline. It's weird, but by saying Chris Wallace couldn't answer the last 5 questions, he's essentially saying he believes Chris Wallace is suffering from cognitive decline. Now, this entire portion of the interview is crazy also because the test doesn't have 35 questions. Although it's based on a maximum score of 30 points, it doesn't have 35 questions. And that's sort of a weird thing for Trump to say. It is also crazy for Trump to say Chris Wallace couldn't get the questions right. But now we have heard from Dr. Ziad Nasruddin, who developed this test. And Dr. Nasruddin is now speaking out and saying, listen, this talk about tough questions doesn't make any sense. This test is supposed to be really easy for anyone who's not cognitively impaired. Trump talked about acing the test. like it's some kind of an accomplishment when he spoke to Hannity. I believe it was last week. Remember this one?
He didn't mean that because he hasn't taken any cognitive tests because he couldn't pass one. I actually took one when I very recently when I was, the radical left was saying, "Is he all there? Is he all there?" And I proved I was all there because I aced it. I aced the test. And he should take the same exact test, a very standard test. I took it at Walter Reed Medical Center in front of doctors, and they were very surprised. They said, "That's an unbelievable thing. Rarely does anybody do what you just did." But he should take that same test. But no, he has been totally taken over.
Aced the test. I mean, this is ridiculous. And Dr. Ziad Nasruddin said to Market Watch that, quote, "This is not an IQ test or the level of how a person is extremely skilled or not. The test is supposed to help physicians detect early signs of Alzheimer's." And it became very popular because it was a short test and very sensitive for early impairment. The normal score, according to Dr. Nasruddin, is 27 out of 30. The toughest part is being given 5 words and then being asked to recall them after 5 minutes, and then I believe it's like after 10 minutes. And when you're in the middle of taking a test, this is the point. That part is sometimes the one that's tougher for people, even not suffering from cognitive impairment. But beyond that, this is an easy test where the normal score is almost perfect. The test cannot determine if somebody is smart. The test cannot determine if somebody has a high level of ability. And when Trump said, doctors were shocked, they had never seen someone do what I did on this test, it's outrageous and it's laughable. So the big takeaways here are Trump said that the questions get tough at the end. That's not true. That's a concern. Number 2, Trump said he recently took it. We've not been told that Trump took this test since 2018. As far as we knew, Trump took the Montreal Cognitive Assessment in 2018. So if Trump was again tested recently, it would be worth knowing why, where, and what the circumstances were, because that's not actually been revealed. And number 2, again, Trump talks about 35 questions and the last few are hard. If he's talking about this test, that's a real problem. If he was given some other test, then that would also be important for the public to know. And then lastly, maybe most importantly, Trump doesn't understand the nature of this test. Like when he talks about acing it and impressing doctors, this is a test where unless you're suffering from cognitive decline, you do really well on it. It's not that doctors would go, wow, you really did it. It turns out that you're not actually suffering from cognitive decline. We're so impressed with you, Mr. President. That's weird. And that's another question. Now, the other thing is people don't even typically take this test unless there's a question about their cognitive ability. Now, maybe because of all of the things swirling around Trump looked for a test to take. But it also shouldn't be ignored that in normal circumstances, this is a test that a physician would suggest if they have some reason to think it's important to screen out cognitive decline. Who knows? Every aspect of this just stinks to high heaven. And as usual, Trump's discussions of the test only raise more questions. How many questions are on it? Why did Trump find them tough? Which test did he take? Who administered it? When did he take it? Why hasn't it been mentioned? Or is he talking about 2018? I don't know that we're going to get answers to these questions, but the important thing is we don't really need any answers to these questions to know he has to be voted out in just over 3 months. That part is clear, and that's what's making this increasingly simple for more and more voters, at least the ones that I'm hearing from every day. Let me know what you think. I'm on Twitter at @Pakman. Also, remember to get the daily audio podcast on your favorite podcasting app, whether it's Stitcher, iTunes, Google Play, Pandora, Spotify. We're on all of them. Get that daily podcast every single day, usually around 3 Eastern is when it's out.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The David Pakman Show depends on your support, and the easiest way is through membership, which includes the world-famous bonus show, as well as commercial-free audio and video streams of the show just for members. Sign up today at joinpakman.com. Coupon code saves you 40%. Vote soon 18.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are David Welty and Edna Warnecki. David and Edna, thank you so much for your support. Also, a big thank you to Rod Gratz, who has been a member for almost 5 years and is today's longtime sustaining member of the day. Thanks, Rod. Very much appreciate. Grab yourselves a membership at joinpakman.com. You'll get all of the great member benefits, the commercial-free audio and video streams of the show, as well as the daily world-famous bonus show, and so much more. Joinpakman.com is the place to sign up. So yesterday, I didn't have a chance to get to this, but I do want to play this clip for you. Donald Trump has launched yet another attack on elements of plumbing, including shower heads and dishwashers. And this has been a really bizarre obsession for Donald Trump. Here he is a few days ago talking about, I guess, how Democrats don't want you to have reasonable water pressure. Democrats, I guess, as far as Trump is concerned, want very beta showers, whereas Trump wants powerful alpha showers with high water pressure or something. See if you can understand what Trump is talking about here.
Cases lower than that. We're bringing back consumer choice in home appliances so that you can buy washers and dryers, shower heads and faucets. So shower heads, you take a shower, the water doesn't come out. You want to wash your hands, the water doesn't come out. So what do? You just stand there longer, or you take a shower longer? Because my hair, I don't know about you, but it has to be perfect. Perfect. Dishwashers, you didn't have any water, so the people that do the dishes, you press it and it goes again, and you do it again and again. So you might as well give them the water because you'll end up using less water. So we made it so dishwashers now have a lot more water. And in many places, in most places of the country, water is not a problem. They don't know what to do with it. It's called rain. They don't have a problem. And old-fashioned incandescent light bulbs, I brought them back. They have two nice qualities. They're cheaper and they're better. They look better. They make you look so much better. That's important to all of us. But they're better and much cheaper. And they were mandated out, legislated out, and we brought them back, and they're selling like hotcakes.
So this is like a completely outrageous rant. I mean, these are truly the rantings of a madman. It's meaningless nonsense. This is the type of stuff where, you see someone in the subway yelling about this stuff. You probably call crisis services and say somebody seems to be having a mental health incident right now. And these are the things that Mike Pence sits in the front row and nods along as if this is normal to hear from a president of the United States. And this is not the only time that Donald Trump did something like this. Back in December, feels like years ago, but it was December before we at least knew that coronavirus was in the United States. Trump ranted about light bulbs. And remember him saying people are flushing toilets 10 or 15 times?
Companies are very happy about that. But together we're defending the American workers. We're using common sense. We have a situation where we're looking very strongly at sinks and showers and other elements of bathrooms where you turn the faucet on in areas where there's tremendous amounts of water, where the water rushes out to sea because you could never handle it. And you don't get any water. You turn on the faucet, you don't get any water. They take a shower and water comes dripping out. Just dripping out, very quietly dripping out. People are flushing toilets 10 times, 15 times, as opposed to once. They end up using more water. So EPA is looking at that very strongly, at my suggestion. You go into a new building or a new house or a new home, and they have standards on where you don't get water. You can't wash your hands practically. There's so little water comes out of the faucet. And the end result is you leave the faucet on and it takes you much longer to wash your hands. You end up using the same amount of water. So we're looking at very seriously at opening up the standard. And there may be some areas where we'll go the other route, desert areas. But for the most part, you have many states where they have so much water that it comes down. It's called rain, that they don't know what to do with it. So
it's really weird. Like, what is Trump doing in the bathroom that he's flushing a toilet 10 or 15 times? That's really strange. And this is about something, right? And it's actually about a few things. First is this obsession Trump has, not just with toilet flushing, but rolling back regulations. And the idea that the right has wanted to frame up for a long time is there's so much regulation. Everybody's overburdened by regulations. Businesses, construction companies, consumers, it's this burden, backbreaking burden of government regulation from Obama, of course. There's, the water pressure's too low. You can't wash dishes. You can't shower. You can't properly use the toilet, apparently. And so they want to frame regulation-happy Democrats under the Obama-Biden administration as passing too many regulations. And Trump is unburdening us by canceling those regulations. Now, this is, of course, completely crazy. Like, everything's fine. Water pressure is fine. Dishwashers are working fine. Everything's fine. Here in Boston and Massachusetts, I should say, we have some of the strictest building code when it comes to efficiency and appliances. I run my dishwasher one time. It's a beautiful thing. I flush my toilet one time. It's fantastic. I turn on a light bulb. It's a, CFL, and I get all the light I need. I'm able to read my books. I'm able to read my magazines, all of this different stuff. Everything's working fine. Now, and we have some of the strictest building code in the country. The sad thing is Trump is actually sort of tiptoeing around an issue I would love to see a president make their issue. Water quality. Much of America has disastrous water quality. In some parts of the country, you can't drink the tap water. In some parts of the country, you can, but it's pretty vile. Flint, Michigan, obviously the situation is worse than that. And I would love it if we had a president who said, water quality is going to be my issue. This is a serious issue. You read about water quality at a global level, you find out that there are so many deaths just from lack of water that is safe. You have, adults and children dying from water quality related issues, parasitic infections, diarrhea, etc. If we had a president, listen, there's so many things a president can focus on. That's the truth. If a president said, I'm going to do all of these different things, but one thing that's not getting enough attention is water quality in the United States. It's an issue of civil rights. It's an issue of economics. It's an issue of class. And globally, my goal is to reduce by half the number of people that are getting sick and dying because of lack of access to just safe drinking water. That would be such a material improvement that a determined American president, as the so-called leader of the free world, most of the time, could do. And Trump is talking about water, but he's talking about flushing toilets 15 times, and I guess low-flow water heads or something like that. Trump really just making little sense during this event in general. Here is Trump saying that there will soon be announcements of things that nobody thought possible or had even conceived of.
So we have many exciting things that we'll be announcing over the next 8 weeks, I would say. Things that nobody has even contemplated, thought possible, and things that we're going to get done, and we have gotten done. We've started in most cases, but it's going to be a very exciting 8 weeks. 8 weeks, like I think, Mike, we can honestly say nobody's ever going to see 8 weeks like we're going to have.
Yeah, they're going to announce things that no one has even contemplated. Crystal clear, right? So something is very wrong here. I don't know whether I would say the wheel is spinning, but the hamster is dead. I don't know if I would say, because we're talking about lighting and shower heads, the lights are on, but nobody's home. I don't know exactly what the right phrase is, but this is truly a man disconnected from reality. And I keep going back to 36, 38, 39% of the country supports this. There's people out there who see this and they say, yeah, that's what I'm voting for. I'm voting for this. The guy ranting about light bulbs and flushing toilets. Millions, tens of millions of people will be voting for what you just saw in November for another 4 years of that. And as I've said before, that's as scary. The Trumpists are as scary as Trump. And the reality is we will have Trumpism for longer than Donald Trump is in office. Whether Trump leaves in January or January of 2025. Either way, Trumpism will outlast Trump, and that's going to be a real problem we have to deal with in this country for a long time going forward. Here's a short venture into the failed ideas that are floating around to fight coronavirus. Louisiana is a state that is really suffering with coronavirus. Louisiana has the fourth most cases per capita. Louisiana has the seventh most deaths per capita. But most importantly, the disease is quickly returning to Louisiana, where from early June through yesterday, cases have gone higher and higher. Louisiana has more people actively infected today than at any previous point during the pandemic. So what does Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards do? Well, he obviously calls for 3 days of prayer and fasting. Now, Bel Edwards is a Democrat, by the way. He says pastors reached out to him and said, you know, you should maybe support fasting and prayer to deal with the virus. So he's going to be calling for it statewide. Take a look at this.
I do want to let you all know that every couple of 3 weeks, I have the opportunity to have a conference call with hundreds of pastors across the state of Louisiana. Last week we had such a call and received a request that I'm happy to honor today. And I know it's a little bit unusual, but I think it's something that's important, at least for me and those people on the call and many other Louisianans. So I'm going to call for 3 days of fasting and prayer for our state for July 20th through the 22nd. So that's the 20th, the 21st, the 22nd. This will be the spiritual diet and exercise that I, as a Catholic Christian, believe is very important anyway. So we'll be doing lunch fasting for those 3 days and certainly praying as well. Praying for the people of Louisiana, praying for those who are sick, praying for those who care for those who are sick, and certainly praying for the families of those who have passed on.
You know, he is right when he says it's unusual. That started yesterday, by the way, July 20th. The fasting and prayer supposed to be yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Now, as Hemant Mehta said, Hemant Mehta said in a blog post, what Bel Edwards does in his spare time is really his business. But what pastors want him to do should be irrelevant from the standpoint of public announcements as the secular governor of the state of Louisiana. Now, I don't mean personally a-religious. I mean that the governorship itself should be secular, separated from religion. There's no reason to tell people of the state to do a religious ritual to fight a virus. We know what he should be calling for. We know what needs to be done. Everybody should be wearing a mask, which he did say in his defense. No large group gatherings, mostly stay home, certainly no indoor dining. We know what to do. And the mask part he did say. But he's calling for prayer and fasting. And, you know, some people are defending this by saying, he said this is non-denominational, right? Skip lunch and pray regardless of your denomination. What about people who aren't religious? This is still a government actor who is supposed to be separate from the church, establishing a religious act. I mean, prayer is a religious act over non-religion. And it's another example of this, you know, we've tried nothing and we're out of ideas. I mean, he's already going to prayer and fasting, and it's a Democratic governor, not a Republican. This is not about political party for me. Mostly this type of stuff is in the Republican Party, but here's an example of it from the Democratic side. This is certainly a conservative Democrat. Don't be confused, but still, this is a Democrat. And it reminds me of the situation in Mississippi, actually. We've talked about Mississippi. Mississippi is tragically suffering and has been for decades in the United States. And yet they're talking and doing nonsense. In Mississippi, it was, how can we block black voters from voting? Or how can we make sure that more real Mississippians register because the blacks are really registering to vote? Meanwhile, Mississippi is almost dead last or dead last in healthcare, education, et cetera, et cetera. Louisiana is one of the most ravaged states by most indicators. Louisiana's 45th in healthcare, 48th in education, 49th in economic growth, 48th in infrastructure, 50th in dealing with climate change. It's a disaster in Louisiana. And then you look over And how are they dealing with coronavirus? Well, the governor suggests skipping lunch and praying. Now, someone wrote to me something that is interesting, which is, could this be indirectly brilliant? In other words, Bell Edwards could be appealing to religiosity by saying fast during lunch. Lunch is when a lot of folks go out, especially if they're working. Maybe by saying skip lunch, he's keeping people out of restaurants and it's actually going to stop the spread. I don't know. It's an interesting question. It's certainly the most charitable interpretation of fast and pray to stop the virus. But that's not really what this is about. This is not about reverse engineering some way in which a call for fasting and prayer might connect to better health outcomes with coronavirus. This is a governor, a public elected official. He has no place suggesting religious prayer and fasting on the say-so of Christian pastors as a solution for a public health crisis. And again, look at how poorly things are going in Louisiana. We have to ask whether these things are connected. We're going to have more about this on the David Pakman Show Instagram page. Make sure you are following us there at David Pakman Show. And while you're on your Instagram app, follow me at david.pakman. We'll take a quick break. We do have tragic news to discuss coming up after the interview, and I hope you'll be with me at the end of the show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The David Pakman Show depends on the support of our viewers and listeners, and one way to keep us going is through Patreon, where you can pledge as little as $1 per month or as much as you want at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Great perks and benefits as well. Read about them.
Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Alex Vitale, who's a professor of sociology at Brooklyn College and also author of the book, The End of Policing. It's so great to have you on, Alex.
My pleasure, Dave.
So this is extremely timely, and there's so many different things I want to ask about. You've been studying this issue of different policing practices and techniques. You've looked at militarization of law enforcement, the expansion of the role of police over the last 40 years. And right now, one of the big discussions that's happening in light of the George Floyd protests and this is not my opinion, but according to polling, not a particularly good handling of policing and race relations by the current president. There are discussions about what should happen with police big picture. So can you, just to give us your 30,000 foot overview as someone who's been following this for a long time, the claims that are now being made are not new to you. What do you think is at the crux of the debate that's happening now?
Well, I think that following the police killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson and Eric Garner in New York and so many others, the Obama administration, a lot of big city mayors said, look, we're going to fix policing with a set of kind of procedural reforms. We're going to give them body cameras and implicit bias training and de-escalation training, and things are going to get better. And things have not gotten better. You know, the situation out on the streets remains very problematic, and people are fed up with what they feel are these kinds of simplistic solutions. And so what's happening now is a demand to rethink why we're using the police in all the different ways that we're using them. Are they really the right people to respond to mental health emergencies? Are they the right people to deal with school discipline issues and a whole host of issues like that?
So one of the things that sometimes I think makes these conversations difficult in terms of being productive is that the conversations sometimes exist imagining a different world than the one that actually exists. So like as an example, sometimes we hear there are countries in Europe where the default is not that police carry firearms. There's a team that has the firearms, and sometimes the firearms are left in the police cars. But as a rule, the police aren't walking around with firearms. Wouldn't that be something to look at? Now, that sounds very interesting to me. One key difference is those countries don't have the amount of armed civilians that the United States has. So is that a reasonable example of how we need to be dealing with things as they are as our starting point rather than things as we would wish them to be?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is an incredibly practical movement that is about turning people out to city council budget hearings and lobbying city council members, you know. And yes, a lot of it is motivated by a kind of long range desire, a kind of aspirational vision about getting to this better world where guns are not something that people are walking around with as a general case. But I think everyone in this movement understands that's not the world we live in right now, and that this is about a process of creating safer communities by dialing back both problems in the communities and our over-reliance on policing.
I want to get into the ideas that are very, at a superficial level, called either abolish or defund of police. Now, I did a piece about this a couple of weeks ago. My thought was there are sources of funding that should arguably be pared down, funding used for militarization, for example, funding used for certain types of weapons or equipment that really don't have a place on streets but are more for a battlefield. On the other hand, I'm aware of circumstances where pulling money may not actually help, in the sense that we may have a police department that's already understaffed. An understaffed police department is likely to go after the lowest hanging fruit as they see it, which is let's send our limited police officers to the places that we currently believe have more crime. Of course, more police officers in one neighborhood are going to find more crime in that neighborhood, and it sort of perpetuates the problems we're actually trying to solve. So my instinct is that defund may be not precise enough in terms of a starting point, but I'm curious to hear what you think.
So, you know, defund the police was not really a term that was in wide use before the current outbreak of protests. What was happening in dozens of cities across the country were very coherent campaigns about creating new public safety initiatives that people in those communities thought would actually make them safer than just relying on police. And what they would hear from local politicians was, well, there's no money to do that. And they were saying, yeah, but look, every year you've increased the police budget by 5%, 7%. They've got all this new money for all these tricked out tanks and surveillance equipment. And also, some of what the police are doing is actually counterproductive. We think it's actually harmful and destabilizing. So it's about really identifying specific evidence-driven interventions to address specific public safety problems that allow us to dial back our reliance on policing, which has become this tool that's just being used to address everything.
What are the best examples of where that has worked without, as there are some who just oppose any reconsideration of how or when police are deployed under the guise that there will be more crime, it will be more dangerous, the public will be unprotected. What counterpoints do we have where these initiatives have worked?
Sure. Well, I think it's become pretty obvious to people that police should not really be in the mental health business. That between 1.25% of all people killed by police in the United States are having a mental health crisis. And often the police play a destabilizing and escalating role in those conflicts and those crisis situations. And so that's why Albuquerque and Milwaukee and Los Angeles and a whole host of cities are now talking concretely about putting in place 24-hour crisis intervention capacities that would allow them to get the police out of that business. And a lot of them are looking at a model being used in Oregon called Cahoots, that's run by a nonprofit clinic that provides exactly this kind of 24-hour crisis response capacity for mental health calls, homeless people in distress, someone having a drug overdose or some other drug-related, low-level crisis. And the folks in Oregon are extremely happy with the outcome of this approach, and I think we're going to see a lot more cities adopt it.
Now, as a purely logistical question, very often now it's not only police that show up, but it's also firefighters with a big fire truck and that can sometimes be more aggravating to a situation than less. In these situations where you have mental health workers that are responding, is it mental health workers and fire, or is it just the mental health workers?
Well, there might be a need for an EMS response if the situation, potentially involves someone who might need medication or might need to be hospitalized. And there is a lot of talk about these co-response models where police would also respond with these teams, but the evidence on that is really thin, that the police presence is not really adding value to those encounters. There may be situations where a mental health team needs a backup at some point, but having the police there from the beginning of those interactions, much less a fire truck, that's generally not helpful. Though I would say that for someone having a crisis, it's precisely the fact that an armed police officer who is quite likely to arrest them or compel them to go to a hospital, that's what often makes these encounters dangerous in the first place. And so when we take that police response out of the mix, the chances of things going really south is greatly reduced.
When it comes to police training and when it comes to police training, let's open the question there. My instinct typically is that workers are in a position of disadvantage in many relationships with employers, and I'm supportive of unionization and collective bargaining, et cetera. There is a case to be made that some elements that might really improve policing, like, for example, a national database of bad actors, if you concede that most police individually are not problematic, but that a lot of the incidents are happening from a relatively small number of officers, some kind of national bad actor database where police departments are required to report to it, but also new police departments would be required to confer with the database to see if the person they're looking at hiring is on the database. That seems to me like it would be very powerful in eliminating the relatively small percentage of bad actors responsible for a lot of the bad acts. That's something I can't imagine unions would ever go for. What's your sense of something like that and how that should be navigated?
Well, I do think that a national database would be useful and support that. And there's interestingly some bipartisan support for it we've seen. Police unions may not be as quick to object to that across the board as you might imagine, because I think in this moment of crisis, there's a little bit more openness among police leaders and police union leaders to try to do something about that small percentage of officers who generate the most complaints and who are fired for clearly just reasons. Of course, this is not going to solve all the problems with policing, right? There's a lot of ways in which perfectly lawful, procedurally proper policing can still cause harms because we shouldn't be using police in that situation in the first place.
What's the lowest hanging fruit in general in terms of the things that could be done most quickly and easily that would have the greatest impact?
Well, in addition to the mental health example we discussed earlier, I think there's a lot of efforts underway to remove police from schools. I think this was a really misguided idea driven by some real misinformation about the nature of the problem. In Europe, they think we're crazy. They would never do this. We need to get police out of the out of the homelessness business, responding to homeless people who are clearly in distress. I think we need a rethink about the war on drugs. That's a bigger lift, but I think that we've got so much evidence that shows that turning that problem over to police is just such a bad idea.
What about the issue of police immunity, which is now being brought up? I guess generally speaking, the idea that it's too easy for officers not to be held accountable in a particular way that some in the public would like to see because of immunity. I mean, that's certainly not low-hanging fruit in the sense that that would be a huge undertaking to look at that. But how much of a priority do you believe it should be?
Well, I don't think it should be a huge priority. I'm not against it, but I think there's a lot of fantasy thinking that this is going to be some kind of cure-all. And again, it assumes that all the problems with policing are about these small number of videotaped horrible incidents. And the problems of policing are also about the other 10 million arrests they make every year many of them for things that just shouldn't be dealt with through policing. And so getting rid of QI is not going to affect that in any meaningful way. And I also think the political lift, as you mentioned, is going to be so hard on that it would be better to focus on creating these alternative community-based public safety initiatives and trying to focus on that instead.
When it comes to what some call over-criminalization, the fact that there are activities which are criminalized, and that's, of course, a societal choice to make. You mentioned the war on drugs, which certainly would be an example of that generally. But outside of the war on drugs, do you think over-criminalization is a problem? And what specific areas would you want to look at first?
Yeah, I think it is a major problem. The research by the Vera Institute of Justice showed that there are approximately 10 million arrests a year in the United States, and the vast majority of them are for very low-level offenses that are really tied to the broken windows philosophy of policing, which is about criminalizing and micromanaging the behavior of already very vulnerable communities. And it's a way of turning problems of poverty and joblessness and lack of health care into criminal justice problems. But that system doesn't have the tools that are going to help solve people's addiction problems, mental health problems, homelessness problems, joblessness problems. And that's really what we've seen over the last 40 years is the turning of all these social and economic problems into criminal justice problems. And that's why the problem is so much bigger than just a few officers with an abusive track record.
Isn't that by design in some sense? And now I feel like there is certainly a political split where there is a political contingent in the United States that, it's the same folks who they say they're against abortion, and you show them a study that says, great, we know exactly how to prevent abortion, prevent unwanted pregnancy. Here's how you do it. Now, but we don't like those things. And it's about, if you have unprotected sex, you should have to deal with the consequences because that's sort of what's right and moral. In the same ways, we've seen it's cheaper to house and give health insurance to the homeless than it is to absorb the social costs of them being on the street. Well, no, it doesn't fit into the morality. I feel like there's something similar in what you're describing, and an obstacle to me seems the political side of it.
I think that's exactly right, that we've turned a lot of what are really public health and political and economic problems into questions of morality, and that fits with a kind of broader ideology that says that the problems of crime and disorder are the result of individual and group moral failure that will only respond to punitive interventions. And what this does is it lets politicians off the hook for actually addressing things like housing market failures and labor market failures and discrimination in education and employment. And so they don't have to take responsibility for that anymore because the problem is those people and their bad morality. And I think one really powerful example you'll be interested in is Operation Relentless Pursuit, which is the Trump administration's big new tough on crime initiative where they're going to flood 7 U.S. cities with federal agents and money for local police to get Trump's favorite bugaboos, the drug cartels and the gangbangers.
Yeah.
And what this is about is saying that the problems of Detroit and Cleveland and Memphis and Baltimore are not a failed federal policy on housing, jobs, health insurance. No, it's the gangbangers. It's the drug cartels. And this is exactly the process that we have to interrupt.
We've been speaking with Alex Vitale, who's professor of sociology at Brooklyn College. The book is The End of Policing. Alex, I really appreciate your time and your insights.
My pleasure, David.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Whether you're looking for David Pakman Show coffee for your Chemex or French press or a David Pakman Show t-shirt, it's all available on our website, shipping to anywhere in the world at davidpakman.com/gear. Don't miss the bumper stickers too, davidpakman.com/gear.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
some truly tragic, I mean, just unconscionably tragic news to report to you from the progressive media community today. As I know many of you have already heard, the host of the Michael Brooks show, Michael Brooks, has suddenly passed away. And yesterday, in the early afternoon, some of the progressive hosts were in touch as we started to learn of what had happened. And initially, I just sort of assumed that this was wrong. I was misinformed. But ultimately, of course, the news was made public, and indeed, Michael Brooks passed away suddenly. Michael Brooks, I will tell you a little bit about how I met Michael Brooks, but Michael had been working for some years as a sort of co-host and producer for Sam Seder's Majority Report, had ultimately launched his own program, The Michael Brooks Show, which was doing really well, a regular guest on different programs, and someone that I've known for nearly a decade. And indeed, we learned in the afternoon in a statement from the Majority Report, it is with a heavy heart that we announce the unexpected passing of Michael Brooks, a son, brother, friend, and true comrade to so many due to a sudden medical condition. You can check out the entire statement, which talks about some of Michael's accomplishments and essentially points out that the way to honor Michael is to keep doing the activism work, pointing out that his family will release a statement in the near future about how they plan to keep his work alive. And I spoke to so many other progressive hosts yesterday, many of us almost exactly the same age as Michael, and it just sort of like doesn't make sense. It's confusing. There's no real other way to say it. It takes a while for it to even become a reality. And I first met Michael about 10 years ago. I actually don't remember. This was when I lived in Northampton, Massachusetts, and so did Michael. And I don't remember if it was a frequent David Pakman show guest Bill Scher or another friend of ours, Michael Cusack, who said, hey, I know this guy, Michael Brooks. He's big into politics. He does some writing. He's interested in getting involved in what you're doing. And I remember meeting with Michael at this great cafe, The Roost in Northampton, Massachusetts. He had tea, of course, in typical Michael Brooks fashion. I don't remember what I had, but we talked for hours and we decided he would come up to my studio and record some clips. These clips are still on the David Pakman Show YouTube channel if you go back in the archives. And then eventually we got to talking about opportunities, and he had talked about, I would move. I don't know. I'd look at New York. And so I made an introduction. I said to Sam Seder, I know you're always sort of in the mix looking for who are good people that might be able to work with you. This guy's done some clips with me, and I think you might be interested in talking to him. And of course, the rest is history. They met. Sam hired Michael. Michael became a fixture on the Majority Report and ultimately launched his own program. And it is just such a loss to the community. It's a loss in terms of the person of Michael. It's a loss in terms of the political perspective, which, as many people know, Michael and I are not exactly aligned in terms of where on the left we are. And that's okay. And the truth is, since I moved out of New York, I've been much less in touch with Michael. And obviously, how many millions of times has it happened that you fall out of touch with someone and then you lose the opportunity to get back in touch with them, which is exactly what happened now in a tragic sense, quite frankly. So I don't know what happens now. I mean, it's sort of like this is news that is only hours old. I've been in touch with, Kyle Kulinski and our friends over at Ring of Fire, and of course, Sam and Benjamin Dixon. And I saw, our friends Anna Kasparian and Nomiki Konst, all who have said things about this. And there's just no real easy way to synthesize something so sad and so unexpected, other than to know that Michael would want our activism to continue. Michael would want all of us to keep trying to push society in the right direction, because if we lose, he never wanted anybody to lose sight of that. And whether you call it a big picture mentality or a whole world mentality or whatever, and I think the most relevant thing for me from this horrible statement, because of the tragic news that it communicates, is this line at the end about, "We will honor Michael by treating all humans with respect and dignity." I think that is the really important thing here, where this is just bad. I mean, listen, 2020 has been pretty horrible in a lot of ways. The virus, so many people I know with personal tragedy. Now we're adding this. It's not been the best year so far. But I think what we can all, it's hard to be confident in anything when something like this happens, but what we can all be confident in is that the right thing is always to advocate for improving the world. And that's what Michael sought to do through his program. That's what my instinct is we all seek to do with our programs. We'll sometimes disagree about the exact right way to do it, but the point is we're all in this together. And at a more personal level, the importance of remaining in touch and together, not just with individuals. And obviously, having lost touch with Michael over the last couple of years, that's an individual thing that I can say, but also the importance of remaining together in the progressive community and not missing the forest for the trees, which sometimes happens. And if this has the silver lining in the midst of just unspeakable, shocking tragedy, of reminding us of that, and that a lot of those day-to-day disagreements that we may have and conflicts that we may have, they really mean nothing in the end. That they're essentially meaningless in the end. And I think that that's something that's very much on my mind as we grieve the loss of Michael Brooks, something we'll certainly be talking more about in the future.